All right, all right, all right. Looks like folks are enjoying their break. Let's invite you back in as we reassemble. Yeah. Well, welcome back from the break, and thank you for pressing in with us as we continue to think about how we talk to each other and how we move out toward others with the positions that we hold to be true and in good conscience. And we continue to think about how we shape our own consciences, how we shape our own views, and part of what's important to that is the media we consume. I think lots of people have observed that if we're not careful, our discipleship our political discipleship comes from whatever political news outlets we are enjoying, and that's for good and ill. And so we thought it'd be good to assemble some wise folks, some folks who are wise about media, who are in media, to talk to us about intelligent and sane consumption of media. And so what I want to do is just let them introduce themselves real quickly, and then we're going to give them each a few minutes to just sort of address us as a conference, speak to us as a conference. We'll come back after they've each done that, and I'll ask them a couple of questions to get the conversation going. Then we'll open up and grab a couple of questions from the floor. And so why don't we start with ladies first? We'll start on the far end there with Nicola. How about you introduce yourself real quick? Is it on?
Sorry, I'm not very tech savvy. Okay, is that better? So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicola. I'm a religion reporter, have been for about maybe the last 9 or 10 years. Before that, I worked in different parts of journalism in the media. And I'm also the founder of a publication called Faithfully Magazine, and we're in our 4th year. So I'm kind of coming into this from 2 perspectives, I guess. Faithfully Magazine, we're independent. We don't have any investors we answer to or any, overarching organization that we're beholden to. We have our advisors, people that we trust to lead us in certain situations. And so coming into this panel, the question that we were asked is, how do we think carefully about consuming media with discernment, prayerfulness, and Christian virtue? And because of my unique position, I'm kind of flipping it for myself to come into this as, how do I think carefully about producing media with discernment, prayerfulness, and Christian virtue? Because as the managing editor of the publication, the founding editor, I have to make certain decisions. And good or bad, at the end of the day, all those decisions fall on me. I have an associate editor, by the way, Timothy Isaiah Cho, if he's watching the live stream. Thanks, Timothy. Thinking about this on the flip side as not a consumer, but a producer of this kind of media, I found myself going to 1 Corinthians 13, 4-8, which states, "Love is patient, love is kind, it is not envious, love does not brag, it is not puffed up, it is not rude, it is not self-serving, it is not easily angered or resentful. It is not glad about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." So that's kind of like my guiding principle in a way. As I mentioned, we're not beholden to certain organizations, but we're kind of independent, which gives us a certain amount of freedom. Thinking of all of those elements of, the buck stops with me, so to speak, and then also I'm beholden to my boss, which is God. Speaking of your conscience when you're working. And so there's certain questions I ask myself as I'm working, because I see this also as a service, maybe as a ministry also, because I'm a person of faith. If I feel God has called me to do this type of work, it's more than just work. It's a vocation, a calling. So I ask myself, when I get certain articles you want to work on, what's the purpose of the article or the op-ed? Will it actually help anyone? Or is it just a rant piece, an angry piece, someone fired off because they want to settle a score or just put something out there? Is the tone firm and confident, but also gracious? Is it factual? Did the writer actually do his or her research? Because sometimes we do write with assumptions as opposed to verifying whether our assumptions are correct. Do we need to speak truth to power, so to speak? Do we need to actually confront or call out an authority, an attitude, an institution within the church or outside? And that can get tricky too, as being a person of faith, and we're reaching out to other Christians. And, we have friends, people who admire the publication, and people who avoid us, other Christians who avoid us because, we do take certain positions, and we are going to be confrontational when we need to, particularly when it comes to justice issues. Most recently we received a submission from a professor writing about critical race theory, which is kind of like a boogeyman term now in some circles of Christianity. And once that was published, there were two different types of responses to it: those who appreciated having light shed on the issue, and those who, didn't seem to give it the time of day. So there are things like that. But finally, the question I ask is ultimately, does this article or essay we're working on, does it serve the publication's mission, which, if I didn't mention already, is to lift up Christian communities of color and the issues and events they say are important to their faith and to their lives. And even just saying that can sound divisive to some people. So if you're confused about that, please ask me afterward. I have no problem sharing. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Nicola. Gracie.
And my name is Gracy Olmstead, and I am a freelance journalist. I work from home and additionally care for a 4-year-old and 1.5-year-old, so I stay pretty busy. But I've written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Week, and a few other publications in the capacity of a columnist. And as I've been thinking and praying about this question that we're considering today, I want to suggest that Christian news consumption can and should be an act of remembrance, both in the customary sense of the word, which suggests recalling something from the past and bringing it to mind, and in a more physical sense, which I'll unpack in a moment. But first, I believe news consumption has to be an act of remembrance in the way it connects the here and now to the past. Because our news cycle is so incessant and oftentimes focused on the short term, it's very easy for us as readers and as writers, I think, to lose track of important facts, to forget what an important person or politician has done even a few months ago in the midst of what they're doing now. And that longevity of vision, I think, is vital to how we vote, how we pray for our country, how we interact with our neighbors. It gives us a clarity and a depth of thought that is absolutely vital, I think, in this moment. Because news is an account of what's happening presently, but why it is unfolding this way, how we got here, what we should do about it. These are all questions that have roots that I believe we need to really examine carefully. And so, to some extent, I think the burden here is on us as journalists, on me, to serve my readers better by saying no to a hot take in the moment, so that I can take some time to read, to interview people, to pray, and to hopefully offer a piece at the end of the day that has greater context and clarity. And I also believe news consumers can play a huge role here by promoting and praising works that do this work of taking a long view. The importance of history and depth has been on my mind a lot in the past year as I've written a book about the rural farm community in Idaho where I grew up. And as I was writing about this town, I saw over and over again, there's a reason that farmers today are old and white and male. And it's rooted in unjust and racist laws that were put on the books at the national and the local level and that have existed for hundreds of years. And if I leave that out, I'm not telling the story of this place truthfully. I am not giving people a whole vision for why this town is struggling and how to make it better. We have to bring a clear, deep look to these issues, and I think journalists can do some important work in doing that. I think this is also very applicable to what we're considering right now as we go into 2020. An author and friend of mine, Matthew Lee Anderson, recently wrote this about Christian evangelicals, Christians in general, going into this next election. And I think it's apt for this discussion. He writes, "We know we are lost only if we recognize that we came from somewhere and have somewhere to go. When we become attentive to our history, the right choice becomes more complicated. We must consider reasonable ways of untethering ourselves from the encumbrances that past generations have laid upon us, and so enabling us to start anew." So second, I believe news consumption should prompt us to literally remember our communities. The word remembering carries with it this idea of reconnection, of putting a name to something, of being mindful or of placing something. Yet because we often read and interact with news online, I think it can be very easy for news consumption to be displaced and abstract. And so I think there's a way in which we can read and consume news with hospitality, both in the grace we extend, in the way we dialogue with each other, and then also in the way that we have a ministry of presence offline. I remember after the 2016 election, I had a lot of friends who were struggling deeply with the results, and they were arguing and questioning and grappling with these things online. And so my husband and I just put out a message on Facebook and said, anyone who wants to come over for pizza, our home is open and we would love to have you. And we wanted to provide a space for prayer, for support, for us to grapple with these issues with each other, to cry with those who need to cry, to vent with those who need to vent. And I think that is something that's often lacking in online discourse. And so to the degree that our homes and our tables can be a place of healing and connection, I think that could be really powerful and really important in 2020 as well. Somebody else might need pizza in a few months. And then just finally, that local news consumption, I think, can prompt us to remember our local communities, both to call them to mind and consider how we can serve them, and to actually pull them back together in a way that they need to be in a very fragmented culture. As I was working on my book last year, I didn't read a lot of national news headlines because I was so focused on regional news in order to write this book. But I soon realized I was reading the best and the worst of human existence every single day. And it was drawing my heart to the gospel in new ways. I was reading about the Good Samaritans caring for their communities, working in foster care, helping disabled veterans. I was reading about the guy who caught a record-sized rainbow trout and the profile of a local bingo parlor. I mean, it was all there in terms of the joy that you can experience, but everything was also there to feel the brokenness of our world, the sexual harassment, the abuse, the missing children, the stories of violence and death, the stories that make you press into the gospel and make you eager to go into all the world and preach the good news are in our local town newspapers. And I believe we need to be reading them and then praying, how can we love here? How can we serve and pray right here, right now? And in this way, I believe news consumption prompts us finally to remember Christ and his gospel. It shows us the brokenness of our world, our desperate need of a Savior, and it reminds us of the work that Christ has called us to redeem and to heal.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. John, you want to say a few words of introduction of yourself and kind of opening comment?
Sure thing. My name's John Ward. I'm a political reporter at Yahoo News. Before that, I have an interesting history. I was at the Huffington Post working for Ariana Huffington for 4 years before that, covering campaigns. For 3 or so years before that, I was at the Daily Caller helping Tucker Carlson launch that website. That was a previous Tucker Carlson. And before the Daily Caller, I was at the Washington Times. So I have kind of been all over the map in political journalism. I also grew up in Sovereign Grace churches, so that's interesting too.
And you live in Southeast D.C.?
Yes,
all right.
right up the street from your church, which probably makes you ask the question, why aren't
Where
showing up for your services?
Where you at, bro?
So I wanted to start off with a tweet, which I read yesterday. The headline of the tweet said, Bill Clinton says Monica Lewinsky affair was to, quote, manage my anxieties. Juicy. So my first thought when I read that tweet was to either retweet it without reading the article or clicking on the link, or to retweet it with a quote and put some kind of comment like, wow, or an emoji of somebody going like this, you know? But I clicked on the link. I went to the link where the article was. It was a write-up of a documentary about Hillary. And there was a 2-minute trailer there. And I watched the trailer. And after watching that trailer, my thoughts were very far away from kind of dissing on Bill, and much more in the mindset of, wow, Hillary is an incredibly interesting, fascinating, complicated, complex, historic figure. And so when I went back to that tweet, I just retweeted it with a comment that said, after watching the trailer, or I said, watch something to the effect of, watching the trailer is very different than just reading this headline, right? And I think that it really took me back in some ways, that whole experience, to my career as a journalist. One of the first experiences I had with Clinton, first of all, I grew up, my parents would listen to Rush Limbaugh, and I saw I graduated high school in '95, so I was a young person, I was witnessing firsthand sort of the beginnings of the white evangelical church's sort of just hatred for the Clintons take off at that point. And that always confused me and turned me off at the time. And then when I was a young journalist at the Washington Times, I was connected by a guy named Bill Salmon, who I think is now pretty high up at Fox News. He was the White House correspondent for the Times at that point. He connected me with a guy named Bob Tyrrell, who was he ran the American Spectator, and he was a huge critic of the Clintons. And I really wanted to work on books, and Salmons knew that. He connected me with Tyrrell, and Tyrrell had me work, he wanted to bring me in and help me work on a book that he was writing about Clinton after the presidency. And I did one interview with Terry McAuliffe, who I just spoke to the other day, the former governor of Virginia, and then I called it quits, because I could just tell where this project was going, right? But I think that tweet, my interaction with that tweet, really gets to the question for all of us. Because the media is, yes, us, but it's also you. I mean, all of us are engaging on social media and part of this ecosystem. And so I think the question for all of us is, are we creating and adding to an atmosphere of reductionism, of knee-jerk reactions, oversimplification, which ultimately just creates more and more polarization and sort of demonization of the other side, right? So I think that's the baseline question for me and for you, and I have, real quick, a couple bullet points on what to do about them, which is us, the media, but to you it's them, and what each of us can do. So 2 quick bullet points on how to consume the media. One would be obvious, double, triple check the story. If you see a headline and you're like, oh, that seems interesting, but it could be wrong, check it at another source. Find, the golden rule for journalists is, if you are trying to break news, find a new piece of information, double source it. So you have to have 2 people telling you that this is the case. The same should be true for a reader of news. Double source it, right? Or triple or quadruple. And then second, I learned something in preparing for this panel. Because one of the things I think is important is that news organizations have a set of standards that are published that everyone can go look at and hold them to account for. And what I discovered was that the New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, I didn't do an exhaustive list, but they have published standards. What I found very interesting was that cable TV networks do not. They keep them private. Out. I think also Breitbart News, not going to have published standards, obviously. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I am. But I think, if you're in a conversation with people and you're trying to get to this question of who can you trust, raise that issue. Who has published standards, right? All right, real quick, for all of us as we consume news. I have something that I wrote about on Medium 3 years ago called the 24-hour rule. And this was something I wrote when the rush of new information coming out about the Trump administration every day, it seemed like, was crazy, like just so much every day. And I just thought, you know what? For the most part, if something comes out and it just seems crazy, let it vet for 24 hours. Let it percolate. Make sure it gets through. Because, the press is not perfect. And a lot of times the press is putting stuff out there that is part of the story or has, this part right and this part wrong. So just, slow down a little bit on that. Don't react over much to stuff right when it comes out. And actually, the Schumer comments about the Supreme Court were a good example of this. I didn't wait 24 hours to form a judgment on it. I waited a few hours. But it wasn't clear to me at first whether Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, had actually he was saying that he wasn't referring to the court. And so I waited until I could see the actual text of what he said, and it was clear that he was referring to the court before I kind of made up my own mind on that, right? I have a phrase in my mind that I'm going to try to put into my kids. Be archival, not viral, okay? Be archival, not viral. And I think we can each do this in the way that we relate stuff on social media. As a frontline journalist, I was covering an immigration march in Philly, and immigration protest march in Philly last summer. And I won't go into all the details because it'll take too long. But I put stuff on Instagram, video, and then I put stuff on Twitter. And I took pains to make sure that one part of the march, which was chanting anti-police slogans, that I didn't put that on social media in a way that people in bad faith could take that post and say this represents the whole march, because it didn't. Most of the march was not chanting that. But as a journalist, it's complicated and important to not go for the easy likes and retweets and whatever, because the stuff that provokes gets you that. But you got to resist the temptation to go viral by being archival. For a consumer of news, I think becoming an expert on one thing and being a servant to others with that information is good, and then being sort of agnostic and a student on the other issues is a good rule of thumb. And then make time for beauty and rest. And when I say make time for beauty, I mean make time for experiencing beauty, experiencing art, poetry, music, obviously. And then my last slogan is just creation beats consumption. And I have bullet points on that, but I just love that. Archival, not viral, creation beats consumption. Those are some of my big slogans these days.
Amen. So, Nicola and Gracy, I want to invite you to sort of jump in where John left off. He was giving us some thoughts for how to approach consuming media, how to think about our responsibility even in producing things. So, guidance, counsel you would give to the conference as well about those things, about consumption and production, so that we might be more effective as Christians in the sort of public world.
Sure. Well, obviously he mentioned, double and even triple checking your sources. I noticed, I don't know if it's a generational thing, but I have a younger brother, and he has this habit of just sending me like social media news posts. And 90% of the time I click on it, it's not factual. It's just some inflated viral thing. So double and triple check sources. But then also another thing now is we have satirical news becoming more prominent, and learning how to decipher between what's actual fake news and someone just being cheeky to get some clicks. And then also even with images and videos, that's another thing. John mentioned making sure you have the full context of what you're watching is just as important as, having the full context of what you're reading. So, there are some tools out there. I think Google image search is a good place to start if you're suspicious about an image someone has put online, on Facebook or Twitter. You can actually, I guess in most computers now, if it's just like on a web page, you can actually right-click on the image, and there's an option for a Google image search, which will kind of show you the history of that image. So that's just 2 or 3 additional things I think would
That's
go with
excellent.
that.
That's excellent. Gracie, any thoughts?
I agree with all those things, and I think they're incredibly important. I would add finding authors who you can follow, who you trust, whose journalism is incredibly thorough and credible, whose writing you can turn to on specific beats that you are interested in. So, for instance, if you really want to know what's going on with religion in the current news cycle, you can follow a religion reporter and follow them carefully and closely over time and check others' work against theirs if you find them to be consistently good at their job. And I think that can be almost like amassing a cloud of witnesses, a group of friends to help you navigate what's happening. And I think it also helps us to hold other journalists accountable by holding up examples of what we all want to strive to be. And I think that can be incredibly helpful and useful going forward.
Amen. I'd love to get questions from you all. So if you have a question, something media related and related to Christian discipleship, just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Just give us your name and where you're from, and then write to your question. We're going to try to get as many questions in as we can. And so, yep, I saw a hand there in the middle, standing up. That's great, brother. Way to model that. That's great. All right. Okay. To my left here, gentleman right up front, Alex. Go ahead, brother.
Hello, my name is Sam. I'm from Phoenix or Scottsdale. My question is on the topic of fake news. The question for you is, what have you learned, or what policies or things have you implemented to use so that in this era of what's called fake news, your stories come out as legitimate? What are some of the things that you've learned and that you now practice as part of the media?
As what? The last part of your question was, our stories come out as?
When it's said, when the term fake news is used, what things are you doing or have you learned as a result of this that have changed your way of producing news and journalism?
Yeah, so has the claim of fake news influenced how you guys do journalism, or what things have you learned in this climate?
I don't know if it's changed how I do journalism, because there's always, you're trained to dig and dig and dig and ask questions and triple check and verify. So I wouldn't say it's changed how I produce news necessarily, but definitely as a consumer of news, the example I just gave, like on social media, these things pop up in your feed, and sometimes it sounds too good to be true, and even in those cases it turns out to be true. But what I suggest is basically just be skeptical. That's all. Don't take it at face value immediately, even if it's from a source you trust. It's okay to Google that headline. Keep clicking through the channel of sources that you see this information passing through. But yeah, I guess that's the basic thing. Don't automatically assume what you're seeing is true. Be a journalist yourself and dig, do a little research. And, as Gracie said, if there are a couple of sources you do trust, you can look for that same story or issue across all 3 sources and see where they differ, or if some red flags pop up. That's basically what I would suggest.
Amen. So good? Okay, so in the middle here? Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Lincoln from DC. Love the point about double-checking sources. How do you do that at scale? If you're reading 20, 30 articles a day, it's just part of like how you just do life. It's not, I don't have time to go and double-check like every one of those. So what are some strategies you can recommend on how to do that well?
Stop reading 20 articles a day.
Can I just say this? My point about that's a good point. But my point about become an expert on one thing and agnostic on others applies there, because, like, kind of what she's saying is you can't cover it all, right? I mean, my full-time job is politics and and news, and I got to pick my spots. Like I got to pick the stuff that I'm focusing on, and if it's not in my focus area, I'm not gonna try to comment on it. I'm certainly not gonna write about it. So I would say pick your spots, drill down on one or two things. If you want to read all that, great, but like I wouldn't worry too much about trying to be an expert on 20 or 30 things, that's for sure.
Amen. Okay, got another hand there?
Hi, I'm Kylie from right here in the DC metro area. How do you all respond to the statement that media is trying to control us or media is telling us what to think? And I ask that because I believe we're media. Media only tells us what we want to think. Media only tells us what we really want to hear. That's why they do it. So how would you respond to that?
Are you guys trying to control us? Absolutely. Yeah. Gracie, any thoughts there?
I know several people who tend to be skeptical of the media, and that's something I've definitely had to have a lot of conversations about in circles that lean more toward the right of late. There's a lot of skepticism regarding the reporting that happens in a lot of mainstream media publications, and frankly, it is very troubling to me to consider the fact that it brings us to this point where we're debating not just columns and opinions, but actual factual truths. And I think we have to be very careful to consider the fact that I think if you are checking your resources, if you are going to sources who do have those statements that they're publishing that fact check stories very carefully, we have to be able to trust certain sources and, of course, always hold them to account insofar as we're able. But at some point, if we don't, we get to this point that I get to with my 4-year-old where she tells me, no, there's 8 months in a year because I want there to be. And I tell her, I'm sorry, that's just factually incorrect. And I see this trend in some right-leaning people, and it worries me. And I think that while we need to always be checking and always be careful in what we read, we also need to be able to rest on those institutional systems that are meant to preserve and promote truth. And like you said, this is also something we can do together. And so where we see a story being reported unfairly, that is where we as readers can come alongside and say, hey, maybe there's another angle, another piece of this story, another fact that could be brought to light.
Yep, you got one here in the middle, and then in the back left, and then up front, Joy here. So yes.
Oh, cool. Hi, I'm Charlie from Norfolk. Question for John.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, brother. You got the mic. Go ahead.
So you talked a little bit about satire.
Hold it closer to your mouth.
You talked a little bit about satire and just kind of how there's been a rise of that movement, kind of almost counter to maybe, I don't know if that's exactly what you said, but for me in kind of the circles that I'm in, there's kind of a push towards satire is maybe not reliable factually, but maybe in the abstract. Obviously, it communicates something that's true otherwise, to some degree, you know what I mean? So I guess what I'm asking is, how do you, as someone who's reporting facts about an issue, kind of address the rise of kind of like satirical journalism as kind of on the rise, not counter to that, but almost as a response in some sense?
I think it was Gracie who mentioned satire, maybe, yeah, okay, sorry, it was not either one of us. Do you want to handle that?
Can you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, there's a lot of words there.
No, just right to the question,
yeah,
loudly
so,
into the mic.
For me, I've found it almost more useful now to go straight to satire to get an abstract concept of what is true about an individual particularly. So how do you respond to that as someone who is devoted primarily to reporting just facts?
Well, I like good satire. The Onion is a classic publication that does that well, right? They're not reporting facts per se, but once you actually get to the end of what they're saying, you do see a nugget of, like, they're pointing out the irony of a factual situation. So satire has its place. I think it's just a matter of having wisdom to simply know when what you're looking at, and they're saying it's satire, is it being ironic? is it trying to draw your attention to consider another perspective of what's going on in a lighthearted way? Or, we do have examples of satirical news where people are taking shots. It's an excuse to tear someone down. So I think it's just having wisdom to know, if what you're reading, what kind of taste it leaves in your mouth.
Nicola, I wonder if there's an analog here on this question to, say, biblical literature. To understand the literature, to understand what you're reading, you have to know what genre it is, right?
Very
And you
true.
have to read it according to the rules of that genre. So I wonder if there's an analog here to the types of news consumption, from satire to a more pure journalism to information or entertainment kind of journalism. If we should be careful, more cognizant than we maybe are often about the genre of news that we're engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to the young lady's question asked about, does the media want to control us? You should be aware of what you're reading because, yes, in some cases, there's different types of media, right? We watch commercials, movies, everyone's streaming now. So it depends on the genre. Is it an opinion piece? Of course, they want you to come away thinking a certain way. Or is it, reporting on a factual event? And, the interesting thing about the political beat, too, you have a whole bus of political reporters covering the same event happening that day, and then you read their various takes on it in a factual sense, and every one of them might find a particular nugget or angle to focus on. So I think it's just a matter of teaching yourself to become more literate about the different types of journalism that exist. It's opinion, is it, factual? Is it, in a sense, like a service piece, trying to sway you to, go this particular way or that particular way? So yeah, I think it just takes time and putting on our thinking skills and just asking these types of questions.
Can I add to that real quick? I think it's really helpful what you just said because I think there aren't the comment about everybody trying to take a different angle from the same event. I think there are actually fewer and fewer news outlets that actually try to just give you the full range of what happened at an event because the business incentives of journalism are pushing everybody to try to distinguish themselves. And so the New York Times is a good example of a journalism institution that reliably gives you the broadest range of facts about what's happening each day. They're not the only one, but they are what's called basically a paper of record. They're a paper of record for the country and kind of for the world. And that just doesn't exist that much anymore. So and when in terms of genre as well, there are genres of news outlets. So there's political ideology, but there's also just issue set focus. And I think trying to find those institutions of record that gives you as much coverage of what happened is a good rule to follow.
Amen. So Louis, you were waiting to get in, and Joey, George, you want to take Joey's question away from him, or you good? And then the brother in the back here. So Louis,
He passed.
you passed. Excellent. All right.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I'm from here in Alexandria, and I kind of want to build on this topic that we're in now, and it kind of includes a prior question. So I think what I'm hearing is that there are skills of discernment and of, kind of parsing through different sources, media streams that we need to be able to flex as educated and again, as wise hearers of different stories. But I think going back to Gracie's response, I believe a minute or two ago, which I've kind of juxtaposed against, I think, something that John said, there's this tension between being skeptical, right? Questioning, finding 2 or 3 sources to validate what you're hearing and seeing, versus what I think I heard you say a minute ago, Gracie, which was at a certain point you just got to kind of trust and believe that there are facts being presented here. And I feel like those are, at least as I hear it, 2 different ends of the spectrum, or maybe there are things that are a little bit at tension with each other. And I think John's recommendation is somewhat practical. Hey, here's a paper of record that you could potentially consult to, find some measure of here's what the most middle ground that we could possibly, potentially come out with is on this story. What other practical tips do you have as we think of, right, not just simply taking facts that are given to us as, well, that's got to be it, versus being skeptical in a way that a lot of people would probably think is, wow, you're kind of a kook who's always, questioning every single aspect of it. Where do we find balance, and how do we read these different stories and headlines with a really balanced perspective?
I think Gracie mentioned the term institutions, and a lot of what I've been trying to get at is by talking about published standards. That's something that a functioning institution does. And I think it was also mentioned at some point that there are layers of editors in a functioning institution, a functioning media institution. That's another thing you can assess. Does this news organization have layers of editors and fact checkers that they run their articles through? So these are just, objective things. And I think the question about 20 or 30 sources gets at the problem that everybody has, which is I don't have time to fact check everything. Like I need, at some level, to feel like I can go somewhere and get accurate information. And that, I think, takes me back to the point about, okay, if you want to be useful, be an expert on one thing and be a student on others. But I do think those objective standards, do they publish their standards? Do they have editors? Are very important. And then, I understand if you want to check it against other sources, that's fine. But I think those objective standards of what's an institution are important. And I do think you can, once you identify those, have a certain level of trust in at least the accuracy of the information.
And just as a note, that it really shouldn't ever be blind trust, which I think everything that John's laying out is an example of how you can look at and become educated on the things that make a newspaper or a news publication thorough, thoughtful, factual, and then you base what you read upon those standards that you can then begin to build a foundation upon. So never a blind trust, but kind of figuring out what can I trust, what will guide me forward, and then acting on and reading those things.
Amen. So just down front, George and Joey, if you both want to ask your questions, we'll make these the last two that we take. We need to take a break.
I'm from up the street. Sideways question, so if you need to pass on it for afterwards, that's fine. But I'm thinking about what the brothers have been saying in old talks before this, last night and today. And my question is in a lot of disunity we've seen in the church lately and arguments within the church, has that affected you in your profession as far as what type of obstacles have you seen as a journalist from other Christians in the church against you or any type of persecution, and also in your profession? So within the church against you, and what type of obstacles and persecution have you had to struggle through with that, and then also in your profession?
Okay, excellent. George?
George from Anacostia River Church. Just from each of you, maybe a good source, good institution that you rely on, whether that's a podcast, newspaper, video. And I'd ask one for kind of nation, world matters, and one for Christian or religion matters, if you would.
Okay, so two questions. Have you faced any sort of persecution from other Christians or inside your profession? And any recommendation you want to make for a source? I assume the sources you work with, but any addition to that? So we'll just go right to left, or John that way, whatever that is. John, you want to start there?
On the first question, no. I mean, my only concern is that people are questioning, as Gracie said, basic facts, and there's increasing confusion about what's true at the basic level, and I am grieved to see the way that the president actually seems to take an interest in making that problem worse. But in terms of sources, I mean, there's so many I could mention. The news issue of the day that's most prominent is obviously the COVID coronavirus. This is a good example actually where I have really kind of filtered a lot of my news consumption through a couple people on Twitter, one of whom is Lori Garrett, who wrote a book on, I think she won the Pulitzer for a book on infectious diseases or pandemics. There's another guy who, maybe his last name is Gottlieb, I can't remember, but on Twitter, I'm trying to actually limit the amount of information I consume on that issue, know what I need to know, and know it from people who know what they're talking about. Lori Garrett's a good example of that.
Was the question on pushback from within the church and without the church?
Right, so within the church, from other Christians,
Yeah.
and then within your field as a journalist, as a Christian in that field.
As a columnist, I do get a lot of pushback from other believers, especially if I, as someone from more of a conservative background, I've gotten a lot of pushback by calling out the Republican Party for what I see as being pro-life only on abortion and then anti-life on pretty much everything else. That's my opinion, and it's gotten me in a lot of trouble a lot of times. But I believe that if I write thoughtfully on this issue, hopefully I can help others to understand some of what I believe can be blind spots that need to be addressed. And that's part of my job. In terms of sources to read, I have really loved a lot of the reporting The Atlantic has done lately. Emma Green on religion is wonderful and does really important stuff. Christianity Today has been a great resource for both secular and religious news. And I've also enjoyed reading Faithfully lately as well. So those are a couple.
Nicola?
So I'll answer the first question and start off by saying I would use the term persecution rarely in this context anyway. But some things I've encountered. I used to work in secular media. Started out at Vibe.com. I worked at CBS News, AOL News. And frankly, I've never had any type of tensions there because of my faith. But coming into the Christian space, the evangelical Christian space, coming out of that was interesting. But I won't, spend time there. I'll talk about my work at Faithfully because Faithfully is a distinct publication, right? It's centering on Christian communities of color. And when I first launched a Kickstarter campaign for our initial funding, people would come to me, oh, you got to soften that for the white folks. Because if you just say Christian communities of color, they're going to think you're excluding them. And it may sound like that, but so we do say nowadays we're ethnically inclusive, an ethnically inclusive publication that focuses on Christian communities of color. And that's obvious because if you've been paying attention at all over the past few years, even in Christian media, it has been tilted towards white evangelicalism. That's just a fact. So I just saw a space there. People were talking to me, about that, and I just jumped into it, and it's become something that turns out it's necessary. So what I've encountered, though, or maybe three things with Christians. The whole thing of just being very secretive when they're being challenged or questioned about something that is questionable. They can shut down real quick as if you're calling up someone in the, secular area to talk about a particular issue or just answer a question. They can shut down. And then there's the other end of it. Sometimes you can be very naive. Yes, I'm a Christian. You're a Christian. But I'm a reporter. So we're not necessarily we're not sitting at the communion table. I'm doing a job. And so I do take care when I'm talking to people. I'm saying, this is on the record. I'm going to ask you these types of questions. Be aware. You don't have to answer everything. And even it comes into play sometimes with people I'm familiar with. We would consider each other friends. And I will really emphasize, hey, say off the record if you don't want me to put this on the record. So I guess primarily it's those things, and it can become a bit murky because, as I said, Faithfully is it's a vocation, it's a service. and in a way, it's a ministry. And I'm serving you, you know. I want Christians of color to feel like they have a platform of voice. You know, people are talking about the things you think we should be talking about. So it can get murky when, you know, I meet people and there is this type of expectation like, oh, she's gonna be in our corner, and maybe, but at the end of the day, I'm a journalist, and there's certain lines that have to remain in place, even if we're buddies. So those are the types of things I have to work through constantly.
Amen. Let's thank the Lord for our panelists here. I think maybe they're going to hang around for a few minutes, and maybe if you want to have a follow-up question or so, they can talk with you. But let's take a break now. Let's come back here at 4:10, and we'll be preparing for our next session.